Okay, good morning. Welcome to this e-Memoir session with Beej Kaczmarczyk. This morning we're looking at the changing funding landscape and implications for the FE and skills sector. I'd like to keep these sessions as interactive as possible, so feel free to use a question or chat facility, and we're always happy to help. Over to you, Beej.
Thanks very much, Manik, and thanks everyone for listening in. And sorry again for the delay. I did touch the wrong button and it has delayed us by 2 or 3 minutes. As Manik said, over the next hour or so, what I want to do is take a wee bit of if you want, a state of the nation view of what is happening in terms of the funding landscape for all of us in the post-16 FE and skills sector. And this is a presentation that I've been doing, going around quite a lot of providers, working with your senior teams, your management teams. I think it's about a little bit of reflection, but also a little bit of looking to the future, particularly in the light of all of the recent political changes that we've undergone. As Manik says, you get copies of the slides and the actual recording, so don't worry about that. And please, as you have done in the past, ask questions as we go along or make comments. And if I don't notice them, Manik certainly will, and he'll moderate and ask me to look at those questions. I want to start with a wee bit of, if you want, policy context. What is happening in the bigger policy context that's having an impact on the way in which activity is funded in the FE and skills sector? And these are just some of the things that I think are still around. Despite what's been said about perhaps addressing these issues of austerity after all these years, I think there's still a need for any administration to look at the budget deficit and the amount of public sector borrowing. And obviously there are some issues there about some of those budgets being significantly reduced in past. And don't forget, the post-16 budgets are departmental expenditure limited budgets, which means they can be changed, unlike some of the other commitments that have been made. Clearly, of course, that's going to be very much affected by what happens in terms of the formation of this administration and what might appear in the Queen's speech and in the first budgets. But I think nevertheless, there is still that drive there, whether we address and remove the budget by 2020, 2022 or 2025, there's still a sort of trajectory there that we've got to understand. Also sitting there in the light of the skills plan, in terms of the issues that we've got in the UK about relatively low skill levels, even though we've got relatively high levels of employment, and the impact this has on the levels of productivity. And here, the connection between relatively low levels of productivity and the investment in skills, particularly in apprenticeships, is well known. So again, that's giving us a context which now takes a little bit more shape, although we don't know how this is going to be affected by the change in the administration or its change in the administration's focus, is the desire to have more devolved powers, and that includes funding to local enterprise partnerships, the new city regions, once they've appointed, obviously, mayors, and any other local forms of commissioning. And I think that's going to have big impact, particularly on those of you who are quite reliant on the adult education budget for a significant portion of your finance, and obviously in terms of the types of provision you're making there. Something that's quite specific, though, is the issues that all of this has in the context of what it means for the finances of FE colleges. Although here I would say that we've also got to take account of the rather precarious state of some of the finances of independent training providers and local authority providers in the light of things that have happened in terms of procurements that have been delayed, both for the adult education budget and for non-levy paying apprenticeship provision. And there are some significant deficits that are worrying, obviously, in terms of the sector's ability to sustain small knocks, particularly when those funding are knocks in funding, but also in what it means in the ability of the sector to invest in the medium to long term, and also the significant cost variations that often exist for the same activity, whether it be a study program or an apprenticeship. There are very different cost variations between different types of providers, and even within the same type of provider, such as a college, there are significant variations in terms of the same activity. Now, all of this is very much then in the context of what's been happening in the skills sector now since 2010. We've had obviously area reviews. We've had a focus on providers being much more specialised. We've got the issues around focusing on technical and professional and vocational education, restructuring of all sorts, mergers, federations, training providers being taken over by other training providers and by colleges, etc. And of course, the new sort of institutes of technology which are being proposed and the finance for those both in capital and revenue terms. Underpin all of this with major curriculum changes, not only in the introduction of standards to gradually replace frameworks for apprenticeships, but also the new proposed technical level qualifications, as well as the changes to A-levels and GCSEs, and of course what might be the funding for those types of provision. So if you look at the general sort of context that sort of, if you want, gives us a direction in which the funding landscape is changing, you can see that we obviously expect more apprentices, more participation of 16 to 19 in study programs, more traineeships, more English and maths qualifications being achieved. And even better in terms of the levels at which people achieve, their performance indicators such as progression to employment, progression to apprenticeships, the focus on positive destinations and outcomes. And it's increasingly becoming clear that in real terms, it's for less money, even though in some cases the money is being held at the same level. For example, 16 to 19 study programs. In real terms, this is actually a reduction. So I think with that very much in sort of context, then what we've got is a set of, if you want, drivers that are pushing the sector, whoever you are in the sector, to look at things like cost efficiency, cost effectiveness in terms of the outcomes for every pound that's being spent, particularly the public pound. What does this mean? Well, in terms of what it means for the whole sector, there's, I think, sort of four things to look at. Here is the significant reduction in the number of entitlements to really just 16 to 19 being entitled under study programs, and that is extended obviously to 19 to 24-year-olds with education healthcare plans, and the reducing level of adult entitlement, such as the first level 2, the first level 3, the English and maths entitlement, and obviously under the flexibilities which we've got, some entry in level 1 provision. But generally you can see the direction of travel, certainly in the last, since 2010, has been to less dependence on public funding and more dependence on other sources of funding. So that funding landscape is reflected, I think, in three quite significant changes. One is increasingly adults who want to undertake training and education at levels 3 to 6 will have to find it from their own resources. Other than the level 3 entitlements, which are only there for 19 to 23-year-olds next year, you'll see there that there's a significant more emphasis on people paying a fee, and that in this case is a fee that reflects the full cost of the provision, and that's going to be funded by advanced learner loans. And of course the big issue here is, how do we increase the demand for loans so that we use up more of the facility, for example, access to HE, management programs, higher level programs and things like accounting, when we've not actually used up those facilities, although we're getting closer to using the facility as we become more confident. But you can see that direction of travel is also there, obviously, with the impact that's had on higher education in terms of participation. The second big driver, I think, that indicates much more control over funding is moving away from the public purse and from this concept of a grant, increasingly in the case of what happens with levy. And here we've got the introduction of the levy, apprenticeship levy for larger employers, set at 0.5% of the pay bill over £3 million with a top-up of 10% from the government, and that's obviously affecting about 2% of the providers, but they are of course 2% of employers, but they are significant employers in the labour market. And for the majority of employers, non-levy paying employers, the new co-investment rates, which gives for every pound that the employer pays gives us £9 of funding from the state. However, it does require the employer in both cases to make a cash contribution, either through the taxation system into the digital account, which then comes to you, the training provider, or directly from the small employer through the 10% that they are expected to pay with co-investment. So you can see that the direction of travel is increasingly putting more funding decisions at the level of the individual, advanced learner loans and co-investment, and of course at the individual employer, whether it be a levy paying or a non-levy paying employer. And I think this is also taking more shape at increasingly more decisions at local level being devolved either to local enterprise partnerships, to combined authorities, or to other commissioning agencies such as local authorities. And I think that general sense of the way that the funding landscape has immediately got implications for us. If funding is increasingly coming through the actual beneficiaries or users of education and training, then as an institution, what are you doing to plug into what motivates those individuals, as opposed to grant funding coming to you, which is a proxy for those individual decisions? Increasingly, you're having to work with individuals who are either taking out a loan, making a contribution, or paying a significant proportion of what they are making into the levy and then using their digital accounts. But also, how do you plug into what the needs are at local level in terms of your local enterprise partnerships or other local commissioning arrangements? And I think it's got implications for the way that you behave, the way that your organisation relates to those individuals or those groups of individuals in whatever shape or form they take. So I think it's a good point then to say, well, okay, if that's the general picture, let's look at each funding stream and see what some of the issues are in terms of, well, what are the implications for us and as we go into this changing landscape, or as we progress through this time that we've had in this changing landscape. I want to just focus on 16 to 19 study programs, because I know for some of you listening in, this is a substantial part of your funding. In some cases, it will be 90% or more of your funding if you're a sixth form college, an academy, or a training provider with that focus. Now, the funding here, at least we know until the end of the last Parliament. Of course, we've got a new Parliament, so to some extent these bets are off. Because originally all of these, if you want, indications of budget were up till the end of 2020 to the next election if it had taken place then. However, I think all the indications are that this will be stable in the medium term, that's between now and 2020. And if we can retain the £4,000 for every 16 to 17-year-old that's got a programme of at least 540 hours of activity, then you'll be okay in cash terms, and you can plan and you can predict the level of funding that you're going to get based on your level of activity, taking account of demography, participation rates. But of course, in real terms, this is a significant reduction since 2010. Now, what also is critical is that you're not going to activate these 4,000s or 3,300s if they're 18-year-olds, unless you also look at the fact that the model is actually a very different funding model. It is a more holistic approach, which says that we fund the total activity that a young person has, taking account of their personal needs, etc. And I did a few webinars on this in the last 2 weeks, showing why some study programs were still not achieving all the things that were expected of them. So whether it be a study program for your 16, 17 or 18-year-old that wants to go into HE or into further study, or a traineeship for those younger learners that want to maybe spend 12 weeks with you, up to 26 weeks with you before they progress to employment and an apprenticeship, you have to see it's a funding in the round. And increasingly, and well over now, 90% of all students are in effect full-time. So we've got the raising of the participation age, which is getting more participation and therefore more 4,000s, more 3,300s or whatever. But at the same time, they're getting bigger. Those students are doing bigger programs of at least 540 hours. And obviously, that's a key driver in making sure that you've got a financially stable 16 to 19 provision is simply learner numbers, and then the average size of those learner numbers as it works through the lagged effect for both numbers, retention rates, disadvantaged funding, prior attainment in English and maths, that all have impacts on how much funding you're going to make. And of course, the big issue here is, where are you in a demographic cycle? Some of us have still got 1 or 2 years before we plateau. Others, you're already on the up. And obviously, this means you've got more young learners and therefore, obviously, more activity and more funding. As I said, the national rate for those 16 and 17-year-olds has been protected in the next year. That's 2017-18, so you've been able to plan your curriculum on that basis. And the other rates have been retained in terms of the bands. One good bit of news is that we've got, in effect, an extension of the relaxation of the English and Maths condition, which, as you know, if those learners didn't meet the English and Maths condition, they were removed from your lag numbers at the full rate. Well, that obviously had a revised set of compliance rules that halved that rate and also gave you a tolerance of 5% of the total value of your students. Nevertheless, last year, that still meant that the sector lost 11 million, although if we had applied the condition in full, it had been closer to 48 million. I think the big issue that's sitting there is not just the demography, it's not just the size of the learners, it's not just the retention rate that you've got and where they progress to. And obviously all of your funding here is very much affected by your new Key Stage 5 performance measures, particularly in terms of destinations. But I think also to say, well, if you're planning for after 2018-19 and you're trying to develop a medium-term investment strategy in terms of capital, curriculum and staffing, is what's going to happen to all those qualifications after 2018-19 as we reform them around the new T levels. We're already working on the new ASs and A levels, the linear approach, the new GCSEs. One thing that clearly is a concern in terms of the government's investment, because remember all of these learners are fully funded, is that the quality of what's happening in terms of study programs has not been brilliant so far. The average grade, certainly across the GFE and sixth form college sector, is 2.7. So we're closer to requires improvement than we are to good. And that obviously is a worrying aspect in terms of the effectiveness and the value for money, which I think is bound to create some concerns on the part of the policy makers. Why are we not getting a better return on investment here? And also on what it might mean in terms of future contracting. I think the big issue here is that not enough of our 16 to 19-year-olds are progressing to apprenticeships, and especially to those higher apprenticeships that we really want to encourage. So a second set of questions really relate to what are the implications for you if you're a 16 to 19 provider, is how are you designing and delivering your study programs in 17-18 to take account of these pressures, to, for example, realize a more cost-efficient model through class size, the use of different staff, as well as trying to get greater impact from those in terms of progression. And I think that's why it's worth sitting down and saying, well, after the first 4 years of study programs and the funding model, how effective have we been as an institution in achieving those things that we wanted to achieve, and what still do we need to address, and in particular, the quality of some of the study programs, which is not just down to English and Maths, there are other factors there. Now, one of your questions already, thanks very much for your question, is how is this all going to be affected by what's going to happen with T qualifications? I was going to come back to that, the new technical and professional qualifications, which are being forecast would need 900 hours of activity, not the current average of about 600 for a full-time learner. So that's a significant, how do you fund a 50% increase in the activity without giving us a 50% increase in the funding? I can't see the average level of funding rising from 4,000 to 6,000. If we got anywhere above 4,000, I think we'd be very pleased per learner. But of course, the second issue there is how do we find the necessary work experience? Because sitting in this system is also the cost of the activity known as employability, preparation for the world of work, and of course the work experience that's required. And in that case, that would be a 3-month commitment, not the current commitment that you've got. So I think there's some significant issues there. For the second line, which is the adult education budget, that's everything that's not to do with apprenticeships. We now know, of course, that's what was formerly the adult further education budget outside of apprenticeships. Community learning, which of course includes significant amounts of non-accredited learning, family learning, return to learning, interventions of all sorts, and as well as the discretionary learner support. Now, we know that that was set for this year at 1.5 billion. Next year it's the same, but it's indicative, obviously, so that's very much dependent what happens in terms of any budget allocations or whatever. We know that the statutory entitlements for first level 2 English and Maths will continue, but don't forget there is also this year, that's 17-18, some flexibility, particularly at local level, around people coming in at entry level and level 1, which might be fully funded because that might then get them into the first level 2, etc. As I said, that's going to be increasingly subject to local devolution after 2018-19, and we've seen that already with some of the city region commissioning arrangements. One thing to bear in mind is that there is a bit more flexibility built into the adult education budget. I know it's only 1.5 billion, and therefore it's one of the smallest of the budgets other than adult learner loans. However, it can fund activities other than qualifications. And here, don't forget, with adult education budget, you're funded by each individual activity, not by the individual learner in totality, like study programs. Here we've got community learning, adult re-engagement, independent living, pre-employment, working with troubled families, health initiatives, as well as obviously the stuff that goes on in terms of community outreach. So I think there's some activities here which I think give you opportunities to become responsive to the needs of your area. And this, I think, in particular is important for those of your community learning providers as you try and shift gradually towards a sort of GLH-driven model, a guided learning hour model, away from the activity previously known as community learning and the issues and risks that's incumbent with that. I think the other issue for those of us who previously were subcontractors who sought an opportunity to get access to adult education budget, or to those of us that contracts were terminating at the end of July, who are looking to have those to new work after August, there's been obviously a procurement exercise there, and of course no decisions as yet. And even this morning, the ESFA has not actually told us what's going to happen there. It is, after all, almost the end of June. So I think at best there, I would certainly personally hope to see that if we've already got an A-B contract and we already do that A-B work in the current year, then let's just extend it for another year until this procurement process works its way through properly. So the big implication here is, if you are providing for the adult education budget market, which includes community learning, how well is it performing? How many of your adults have progressed into a qualification, say from community learning? It doesn't matter what level it is, but at least they're now having some accreditation for their learning. How many of your level 1 and level 2 learners who were out of work have now got a job? And how many of those have now got an apprenticeship? So how well is your adult education budget preparing, particularly those adults who have been some distance from learning, in terms of getting jobs and then progressing into apprenticeships? And I think that, for me, is one of the key performance indicators that's going to be used to measure your effectiveness as a provider of adult education, as well as obviously the other targets such as English and Maths, etc., that we've talked about. So there's another question. And these questions, we're not going to consider necessary in detail today, but I think, use this, share this webinar with lots of people in different institutions, in your own institution, and start to get them to think about some of those questions. I think one aspect of this move and this shift in the way in which funding is working and the changing landscape is advanced learner loans. Now, we know that this year that was expanded to include 19 to 23-year-olds. And it's also now at levels higher than 3 and 4, so it extends up to 6. In particular, this is trying to drive up that big productivity gap, which is a result of lots of people going into the labour market in low-paid jobs with low skill. Now, we know that that facility, well, it was originally intended to grow up to almost $500 million by 2019-20. We know it's available for a wider group of people, and we now know also that it's available for other than, which originally was only available for, say, people doing A-levels, which could do up to 4 A-levels. It's now available for those adults who want to do vocational qualifications, and they can take up to 4 loans either at the same time or or consecutively. So you can see that that shift towards individuals taking more responsibility for the learning, and investing through the form of paying the fee funded through a loan that then repay when you get to a certain income level later on is a significant change in culture, etc. Now, one of the questions that one of you has asked is, do you think we're going to get up to that usage or that demand of roughly 480 million? I think one of the issues is that after a sort of quite slow start, it is becoming clear that providers have been more active in engaging with learners and directing them towards the loan facility than perhaps we might have had at first. So I think that's my feeling. I think we will use up the facility. Certainly in terms of growth, we found it quite important that we have been able to get growth finance because we've been better at engaging with those learners. Now, they operate in exactly the same way. Remember, the loan is supposed to cover the fee. Remember what comes first. Demand for the course comes first. So I want to do this access course, or I want to do this beauty level 3 diploma. How do I fund it? I can either pay the full rate or I can take out a loan to pay the fee. And we obviously, the additional demand, it was a high risk factor in terms of the government policy. They never saw it as being possibly something that would totally take off. But however, we have been getting better at it. And I think the challenge has been to provide is how to increase the demand, which has obviously had implications for two things. How do you design that curriculum and the delivery of that curriculum so that the market says, oh, I'll take out this A, I want to do the learning and I'll take out a loan, and B, how did you market that effectively to the market? How did you get it in so that it became obvious to the person that this was something they wanted to do, you engaged with their motivation? I think one of the big issues though, although it's been identified as a high risk rating in terms of policy costings, and that underpinned the last public finances, is that there's also a significant problem about not enough qualifications at the higher level. In other words, the vast majority, well over 90, if not 95% of learners have taken out loans have actually taken them out for level 3 provision. And that obviously has not activated that higher skills agenda as we expected, partly because I don't think we've had enough provision available for all the learners that might have wanted to do it. They've got a question from Andrew. How much impact do you think independent finance companies have on the overall usage? Yeah, I think there's an issue here because we've certainly found that learners, when you sort of talk about the process of applying for a loan, etc., and of course we know that the loan is got to be repaid once the learners get to £21,000, and it's usually taken back through the PAYE system, is that other learners have said, oh, forget that, I will actually take out my own loan, almost like a career development loan, and repay that, or we'll pay out of some savings that we've got. And obviously that's also got us to think quite differently about the way that some of this learning can be funded, which is more typical of what happens, as some of you said, in other countries. I don't think they've had a big impact. I think that the big issue here has been much more about the demand for learning first, because you don't activate the demand for learning by just making the loan available or the finance available. It's got to be the decision, what do I get from this? What's my benefit? And then what's the best way of funding it? So I think that's a good question. I think what's more important then is to say what have you done to actually activate? Because the implication of moving towards loan funded provision means first of all, you've got to integrate it into your training offer. In other words, you've got to have an offer first, funded by the loan second. It has got implications then for how you promote that offer in terms of modes of delivery, attendance. So can I do it flexibly? Can I do it at weekends? Can I do it in the evening? Do you have a package which includes support? And also what this means just simply when you come to the viability of working out a class. For example, in Access to HE, you might have some learners who are fully funded on their first level 3. You might have some learners who are loan funded because they're over the age of 19 and already got the equivalent of a first level 3. And you might have some that are funding themselves. So how do you know whether the class at 16 or 17 is going to make enough money to cover the £100 or so per hour total cost that you have for putting that class on? We also know, of course, that in loan funded provision, the funding is 100% dependent on retention. And obviously, if you don't retain learners and they don't stay on the program until completion, you lose that, obviously, that funding, because the loans company will want to know how many times they've attended and how many months they've attended. That's also got issues to do with your reputation. Sitting around this, of course, is loan-funded learners come with the same set of needs as any other learners in terms of learning support, as well as support maybe for things like childcare, etc. So that's all got to be part of the package. And I think that's critical then, that you've got to sit down and say, if we want to activate the adult learning market through loan-funded provision, have we got the right partners to work with? They often are good at activating new markets. They're often good at promoting the offer better than you, or they're good subcontracting partners that you've had certainly up until this year. Don't forget, by the way, there will be no new subcontracting after the end of this July. In other words, you've got to finish all your provision off in terms of teaching and learning by the end of this July. So the big issue is, and the big implication for you as providers is, if that's the direction of travel, and we know there's been issues about learners being, sucked into taking out loans for provision that was not good or it wasn't continued. We've also got obviously some other issues about providers not following the rules on this. It's still a challenge, I think, for those of us who see this as a potential source of funding and of activity, is how flexible and responsive can we be? So if you look at a level 3 diploma in beauty, for example, or in management, these are the sort of questions that the learners will ask you. Can I study in the evening? Can I do some of it online? Can we do concentrated period study? Can we choose elements of it and pay for it on a modular route, for example, if it's small enough to be broken down that way? And remember, the minimum amount for any loan is roughly £300. Will it help me gain promotion? Will it make, how will it develop me? Will it make me more effective or productive if I'm paying for it myself and I'm at work? Because remember, quite a lot of people on loan-funded provision have actually got jobs, but they're not on apprenticeships because it's their own decision to follow this type of study. What can I do next? Particularly an issue with not having enough level 4 to 6 provision. And how does it help me in terms of my career and potential routes? So there are many questions that learners may ask before they commit to learning and applying for a loan. I think the implication for us as providers, and I know some of you are very good at this, and certainly, the organisations I'm associated with, we have exceeded our loans funded provision because we have addressed these fundamental changes to curriculum design, delivery, as well as the way we market it. So thanks very much for those questions that are coming in. And by the way, that if anyone needs, we have done a loan-funded webinar in the past. I think it was supported by NCFE, and we've also done it with Ascentis, and I think we've done it with the Institute for Leadership and Management. So if anyone wants, obviously, to plug into those, just indicate to Marek and he'll obviously send you. They were all sponsored, I think, those ones. You'll see that was a real focus on how to increase demand for loans. I think that's, that general issue that's pointing us now increasingly towards more localized decisions is around the devolution. There's a strong push for local control of skills built on all the things we've done. And we know that, for example, European social and investment funds and other skills capital has come through those. But of course, the problem here is the different models of devolution and different states of preparedness, and not every authority is in a position to take on these devolved powers, partly because of the issues around electing mayors, as well as simply the size of these and the other commitments they've got. So I think it's going to happen in stages, and I think the adult education budget is the obvious place. I can't see any of the other budgets, but I can see conditions being applied, not just those conditions I've talked about as well, but increasingly whoever the commissioners are, they're likely to really focus on this. And that is, for I think all of us, irrespective of where you're looking, it's about the labour market, and it's about the post-16 sector. And devolution gets you to really focus on it because it's very much about local jobs, local employment opportunities, and the changes that this has in terms of things like wages, etc., and wealth and income. So what's the role? I think our role is, how do we get people into jobs? First of all, those that haven't got jobs, working on pre-employment, employability traineeship programs, working with Job Centre plus DWP. How do we keep them in jobs and attain the skills they need for those jobs, apprenticeships? And then how do we help them to progress? Higher apprenticeships and other forms of CPD. So I think for most of our learners, and certainly, you know, I'm a governor of a college in North East Derbyshire. Most of our learners are going into local labour markets. Now, what is the challenge? I think the big implication for is if you're just a provider that simply puts out a plan and then provides that provision based on that plan, then I think you're missing the plot here. The change is that I think you as providers have got to be active partners in actually determining where the employment opportunity is and where the community is going to develop. So back into issues about employer engagement, working with the LEP, supporting, rather than just being a provider that waits for the commission, waits for the contract, waits for the tender, you're actually much more actively involved. And don't forget, many of us are also, if we're a college or a large training provider, are quite major providers of employment in their own right. But it's not just about apprenticeships. I think that's the danger, is to say focus on apprenticeships. There are other forms of technical education, for example, the shorter programs, but also what about pre-apprenticeship work? What about all of the traineeships and other forms of pre-apprenticeship training which are critical, particularly when those adults might not have access to English and maths and other skills. So what is really, really critical here, and I think this is a significant challenge in the way that everything's moving, not only in terms of adult education budget, but also apprenticeships, is how effective is your employer engagement. And that also means forming the right investment partnerships with bankers, with the employment departments of your local authorities, the inward investment people, not just the LEPs and those in the city regions. Good question coming up here, and just want to look at it. Yeah, and I think one of the things that this certainly raises, the question says is, well, how do we get all the information about what's happening in the local labour market? Well, just not relying on the labour market intelligence that's coming through from the LEP or from other organisations. I think you might have to fund some of it yourself. Looking at what the impacts on wages are, looking at NC and other systems that might exist, whereby I think you can get a feel for where those employment opportunities are coming in the next, 5 or 6 years. So I think there's some big issues. And I think, of course, that the big issue here is not all of these people, and I think there's a good question just coming in, is, when you look at the LEPs, the city regions, the enterprise zones, the growth deals, the metro mayors, they might not all be pointing in the same direction. There could be conflicting interests. And I think you've got to say that whatever the arrangements are in your area is what are the key drivers here, and who's got the actual purse strings, for me, is important. So if it's the combined authority, which includes an interest with the employers, then obviously I'd align myself with what they're identifying as both local and regional priorities. So, but I do think it's important to realise that although those initial discussions were very much around the adult education budget, particularly around the local flexibilities, there's nothing to say that conditions cannot be applied to other things. And I think one of you has already said that, Jev, I think, is in your area, they're looking at, for example, the unspent levy. I know in other areas, they're looking at traineeships, particularly at 16 to 19, and saying that if, for example, when they're commissioning some adult education work, one of the conditions they say is, and what have you been doing on study programs to activate more people on traineeships? And what have you been doing on apprenticeships, particularly to activate those parts of the community which don't have access to employment and to apprenticeship opportunities? So you can see that different arrangements, and therefore that's one of the things that I think is difficult. If you're very much a local provider with a clear local defined area, such as a LEP or a local authority or a combined authority with a new mayor, then it might be easier. What does this mean for national providers? So if we operate nationally, does that mean we've got to plug into 39 LEP priorities, 6 different mayoral arrangements, all with different drivers? Who gets the final say? It can be very confusing, Paul and Jev. And I think that's why one of the big issues about this is, the danger is that this devolution model with its local commissioning arrangements could in fact lead to a major change in the way in which we behave. In terms, it's easier to work nationally with a set of national priorities. If we move to all of those priorities being devolved, it could be a patchwork quilt of confusion, what I'd call not a coalition of chaos, but a patchwork quilt of confusion. because because government views this as a way of devolving the responsibility to those local services to local people. But in any of the changes in the transitional arrangements, then even though you might try to get a better alignment of skills with local priorities and you might respond to it, then you've got the issues about local outcome agreements being set very much with that in mind, with broad outcomes, but then you could have new funding arrangements. So you could technically end up with 39 funding formula, 39 allocation mechanisms, and 39 payment mechanisms, just if this was done through the 39 LEPs. Now, area reviews were one part of the process in which we're sort of trying to get at least the college sector to structure itself better to meet not only the employment and labour market needs, but also the educational and social needs of each part of the country. But in the questions that Paul and Jev have raised, you can see how no matter how well you might think you're prepared for local commissioning, it will still be there'll be uncertainty and there'll be confusion. My feeling is that, and in response particularly to Jev, that certainly when a combined authority seeks to go for that devolved set of powers, they will often ask for everything. They'll ask for control over the levy. Some have asked for control over 16 to 19 funding traineeships. The health contracts, the road contracts, even one has applied, asked for higher education funding outside of universities, then I don't think that necessarily will be fully met. And in our area, all that we got was the flexibilities around the adult education budget. So I don't think they're very big chances. But you can see that these different arrangements could exist. Essentially what we've got really is a mixed economy offer. I think whatever will happen, there'll always be some national priorities, particularly where we need first level 2, first level 3, and English and maths. And then that balance will change around a local offer, which could, of course, include lots of pre-qualification activity, such as non-accredited learning, community learning, interventions. Now, this is where you can see why devolution would require not just an education and training budget to be here. What about the health budget? What about the budget for things like troubled families? What about interventions that might be required from the Department for Communities and Local Government? You could see all kinds of budgets having to come together, not just ours. I mentioned and thanks very much for those questions, but I mentioned very quickly the technical qualifications as a result of the Sainsbury review and that distinction between academic and technical routes. 2 technical routes chosen, one employment-based and one course-based, provider-based. 15 routes at level 2s to 5, and you can see that all of this is being, developed by the Institute for Apprenticeships. 2 things came out from the original ideas: more planned hours for young people, up to 900 hours for a full-time learner, and of course longer work placements. Now there would be more funding available to develop them. This wouldn't be to deliver them. So of course the big issue we're all got there is how can we deliver these programs cost effectively at the current levels of funding, and the answer is we can. If we're struggling to deliver 600 hours of activity in a cost-effective way. Whatever the routes are, those routes will identify what's going to happen in terms of each of those major sectors in terms of those technical. And they obviously are going to impact not only on classroom-based provision for all those target groups, but also on the implications for, for apprenticeships, and how do apprenticeships and standards fit into that. I think the only other thing to note there is what's going to happen with the Institutes of Technology, which featured highly in industrial strategy, the link to the reforms of those technical qualifications, focusing particularly on higher level skills in the STEM subjects. And that's also come out of the area review process, which has suggested in some areas that there should be an Institute of Technology. The £170 million of capital investment, I don't think will go very far. And I don't think the model should be limited to FE colleges or HEIs. I think we've got to not necessarily even look at them as physical premises. I think we've got to have much wider concept of what an Institute of Technology. So you could have innovative partnerships with employers, with schools, particularly at the primary level, etc. And I think we've got some challenges there. Comment, by the way, for your information, the DFE are behind timescales on T-levels. Draft content was due for consultation. I think that the issue, by the way, it's like saying anything to do with all of this, everything looks as if it's behind schedule. We've had a webinar on T-levels already, which did say that, and I think that's a good point to note. Whether the T-levels actually get off the ground by 2019-20 is a big issue. Whether they get off the ground, you know, there might be a change in policy. But I think we do need to review technical and vocational qualifications. However, we've been here before. Remember 14 to 19 diplomas, remember GMBQs, etc. But I do think that there is going to be, I think, more pressure on us to certainly activate a lot of these markets by working in partnerships. So whether it be 16 to 19 activating those who are not in education and training, working with the local authority, the career service and the voluntary sector, whether you're activating adults through community outreach in the voluntary sector, whether you're activating learners through local devolution deals, I think it's all about partnership, and therefore I think the financial climate is very much going to be dependent. Your response to it is going to be very dependent on how well you work in partnership with other people, other providers, as well as advocates, and that's no better shaped or shown as in terms of the reform of apprenticeships. So we know that as we move from that old model of SACE frameworks, with us as providers controlling a lot of the content, the money coming to us, asking for contributions but not always getting them, we had to understand the funding formula that took account of different ages, different size of employers, different location, even a delivery point. In transition, we've been moving through more control by employers, the new standards through the trailblazers. That's taking some time. A bit like the timescales for T-levels, we're waiting for a lot of new standards. We're waiting for existing standards to actually have assessment plans and endpoint assessment designed. Here, the drive in transition was to give through the Trailblazer pilot £2 for every £1 that the employer invested, with a whole lot of incentives that then came to the employer for young people, for completion, etc. And it was going to be less complicated, therefore employers could understand it, but it was much more about you working with employers and determining a price in one of those 6 bands that you had. The big issue, of course, was the implications of endpoint assessment and how that was going to work, and whether the funding that you were agreeing with the employer would be enough to cover endpoint assessment. But you can see the direction of travel moving from transition towards what was being proposed in terms of employer control, with all the standards in place and having replaced all the frameworks eventually, large employers paying the levy through the taxation system, putting that money into a digital account, having that topped up by the government, 10%, and then using that to pay for training and assessment on apprenticeships only in England, unlike what other arrangements already that have been publicised for Scotland. For all the majority of employers who would be operating in this new market, there would be co-investment where they had to find 10%, not 33% and not 50%, as with the old SACE frameworks and the old system. And all of us would have to go through this process of going on the new register. So that direction of travel, if you look at the funding landscape, shifting power over to the employer for control of not only the content, but obviously in determining the price. And that would involve us having to understand all of those changes in terms of the funding policy. The new 15 bands, what it means for co-investment, how the bands would operate, how there are incentive payments for you for employers to take on young people at 16 to 18, the transitional arrangements for frameworks, which does add a bit more money this year, slightly closes the gap. The incentives for small employers to take on young people, because they don't have to find co-investment at 10%. The additional payments you'd get that would come to you as the provider for anyone that had additional learning support. The additional payments that would be coming to us as training providers for things like learners coming from deprived areas. But remember, that's only for this year. The additional payments were coming to us as providers for delivering the English and maths that's required in a framework or a standard if the learner's not already attained it. And obviously what we'd have to also take account of is that we could use this not only to attract new apprentices and new starts, but also on existing staff who were having to take on new skills, new roles, where there was substantially more skill and different skills being acquired. All of those are being operated from the 1st of May, and we're now into that. And we've covered that extensively in other presentations, but you can see that changes the landscape significantly. And then when you look at how it affects the levy-paying employers, the employers with pay bills of more than 3 million, you can see that if they don't use it up in any month, 24 months later, they've lost it. It only applies to new starts. I was talking to a levy-paying employer recently who thought they could use the levy to pay for their existing continuing apprentices. And they would, I had to explain it. No, this was only for new starts after the 1st of May. That what was in the digital account could only be used for new starts. Everything else had to be covered by what were the prior arrangements, the prior contract. How digital funds would be topped up by funding from the state, how it only applied to English workers. So if your workers spent at least 50% of the time, then that would be covered by the English levy as opposed to the way the levy might operate in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And one disappointing bit was the fact that a lot of employers who are not going to spend their money levy paying would have preferred to have transferred a proportion of it to something like the supply chain or to other employers in the system or to apprenticeship training agencies. That won't be introduced until later. And the key thing here was the use of the digital account as the primary means by which the money would be paid to you, the providers, by the ESFA. Now, what was the big concern? I mean, I'm just sharing some of these concerns. The employers have got loads of concerns, and I've covered that in the past. But I think from a provider point of view, the big concern was with all these changes, moving from an old system to an intermediate system through the Trailblazer pilot funding and to the new system after the 1st of May, is my apprenticeship provision viable? How are frameworks and standards being allocated to funding bands? Some have gone up, standards, for example, in the STEM subjects. Frameworks, some of them have gone down. What does that mean for the same level of activity? Am I going to stay in this business? I think you've all been through that. So we're still finding some resistance from small employers about the 10% because it's got to be a 10% contribution in cash. And very often we're asking for it 3 months in advance or a year in advance. What about price competition? Actually, that hasn't been as big an issue. My experience of post-May is that there hasn't been as much competition in terms of price. We've been tending to say, right, well, this is the funding band. We're going to charge you the top price in it. And this is what we're adding as value to your business. And that's been easier for us to sell than we perhaps expected. What has been more problematic is the payment schedules from employers in terms of their 10%. The completion element, of course, remember, 20% of whether it's a framework or a standard is not going to be earned until completion. That's particularly going to be concerning if the endpoint assessment is not completed for a standard. Some of the cost factors have been removed. What does that mean in terms of you being able to sustain your provision in places like central London, particularly working for disadvantaged communities? I think any of the additional payments, the £1,000 to the employer, the £1,000 to the provider for young people that you've taken on, the 20% top up on frameworks, the extra money for disadvantage uplift based on postal codes, I don't think they come any close to what we were getting in the old system, when you were being paid for a SACE framework. The big problem for us in England, by the way, and it is a real issue, is you've got 3 systems running at the same time. We've got existing trainees on frameworks covered by an old system. We've got the new standards covered by the transitional system, and any new starts, frameworks and standards, post-May, covered by the new system, depending on whether it's a levy-paying employer or a non-levy. So, I mean, one of the things straight away is as soon as you start looking at your model, if you look at your current apprenticeship provision, that's what we did several months back. As soon as we got the bands, I know you've all sat down and said, would the current suite of programs that we're doing, including qualifications, would it be viable post-levy? So, for example, if you look at business admin at level 3, this is for our 16 to 18-year-olds who are fully funded. The framework moving to the standard actually leaves us a bit indifferent. The margin is roughly the same. But if you look at health and social care level 2 for 16 to 18-year-olds, if we move from the pre-levy framework to the post-levy framework, it's in a completely different band. It's much lower. And even if you add on the additional payments, it doesn't make it up. It's slightly better if we move to the standard. And obviously that is critical here. So we not only have to understand the impacts of the bands on margins, we've also got to know what's going on in terms of where's the growth, where are the new apprentices coming from. And it does look as the vacancies advertised in May are actually significantly lower than they were in March and April, which were already reduced from, say, a year ago. So we've got some big issues here about where's the demand. And does that mean our delivery model needs to change? And again, there's the big issue, because you might find that business development teams and your sales team are selling apprenticeship starts at the new values, but do they reflect the actual cost of delivering those new standards, or a reduced value for the post-levy framework? But at the same time, it's about quality. And these are real figures based on a couple of providers that we know. What I've done is I've just made the cohorts the same size. Interestingly enough, should provider A be in the apprenticeship market? It's on the ROATP, but look at its performance against of overall achievement rate and timely achievement rates. I'd have thought in that area that certainly through any model of working out who's going to stay in the market, provider B should be given more of the apprenticeship starts, and provider A should not until it sorts out its quality. I mean, just imagine having 42.6% of its learners below the threshold for the minimum standard for apprenticeships. So this is also, it's not just about is it viable? Can we stay in the market? Can we make enough money to cover our costs and margins? But also it's about who should be in the market in terms of quality. And I'd have thought certainly there would have been an opportunity for the way that we were going through the ROATP to actually make sure that some providers didn't get through. Now we know that providers whose apprenticeship provision has slipped to inadequate now will not be given new contracts, but there are still some issues about some of those other providers. I think the big issue for me and the big agenda item here is, how do you market yourself in the new apprenticeship markets? How do you brand yourself? What values are you putting over in terms of the principles that guide you? How do you position yourself in the market so that people notice you and know that you're a quality provider? And what personality do you come over? The way you communicate, the way that you relate to employers and to apprenticeships. So what language are you using? Is it the language of business, or is it the language of education? But for me, the big issue is, once I've established my brand and my position in the market, it must come to life in the actual experience that the employer has and the customer has in terms of the apprentice. And that's about, how do my sales team, my assessors, my tutors, my support staff all support our position in the apprenticeship market? Because then we can communicate it effectively to the target audience and take account of their buying systems. So how does a levy-paying employer like Debenhams make their decisions? You've got to understand that. How does a small employer make the decisions? And then run the appropriate marketing strategy with them, including business-to-business communications, mail shots, organizational trees analysis, which I know you've all been doing for nothing. I think one interesting approach is to help the employers actually develop their, what I'd call, training provider engagement strategy, their education engagement strategy. I know that you who are listening in as providers, you have an employer engagement strategy. Well, why not sit down with the employer and help them develop their training provider engagement strategies? Because then that can extend beyond apprenticeships to things like traineeships, to work placements on study programs. For me, the most important implication of the changing financial and funding climate and landscape with apprenticeships is putting yourself in the shoes of those employers that have to choose between a whole range of providers to make sure they meet the best needs. And whether that be proven track record, added value in terms of what else do you bring to the equation that helps the business, embedding work-based learning in the business as part of their culture change, the ability to scale up so that if the employer wants more apprentices or a different apprenticeship, you can do it, a one-stop shop. Getting the employer to actually get involved in the design and delivery, and getting them to enable the apprentice to achieve by putting the right coaching and mentoring. I found one big way to engage with employers is to say we can actually help find your talent from our, for example, existing learners. But also we've got to get the pricing and payment strategy right, whichever band you're using, making sure that we can negotiate the price, because every apprenticeship framework and standard goes into one of these bands. Make sure we use the full cost of the band, and we always start at the top, and that wins us a contract, because we also offer all those other things around it, the value added proposals, recruiting, finding talent. We also supply some of the labour through our existing traineeship program, getting the contract right, getting the payment system right. We insist on those payments being at least 3 months in advance, using credit cards, PayPal, but also making sure that the levy-paying employer has a full support service, right? We cannot control the money leaving their digital account, but we can do the student tracking, the admin, the paperwork, and that is, I think, what many levy-paying and non-levy-paying employers want. So these are the sort of questions I think you've got to take away. How can we more effectively as an institution engage a whole range of employers, levy-paying, non-levy-paying? How do we make sure that our curriculum managers, the people who actually run the provision, whether it be classroom-based, the off-the-job training, the apprenticeship, how do they become more commercially aware to understand all of these things we've talked about? How do we increase the contribution rates from apprenticeship provision? One way might be to start to reduce the range of standards and frameworks, because I'm sure, if we have 3,500 apprentices and 70 frameworks and standards, that doesn't mean that we're getting some of the economies of scale that could come from, for example, better caseloads and more effective use of new technology. But I think for me, the most critical thing is, what difference are you making to the employer's business by training their apprentices? If you don't know what your value proposition is, it's very difficult. And we ran a webinar last week where it was the result of a brainstorm that we had with 70 employers. They came up with loads and loads of things. They said, this is the type of thing we want you to provide us, to talk to us about. How do you change the nature of a business, the culture of a business, the bottom line of the business, and the whole range of things there. So I think there's some sort of key issues there that you can see need to be addressed in terms of apprenticeships. So, and again, hopefully I'm picking up some of the questions that we're going along in, and as we progressed. So, two things then. The markets for learning are fast changing. We've talked about the levy and non-levy paying employers. FE and HE learners funded by loans. That's affecting a lot of us as providers. We're looking at the commissioners of adult education and all the issues around those devolved arrangements, and the commissioners of 16 to 19-year-old learners in terms of the ESFA. All of these markets are changing, and therefore we as providers will obviously have to change as well. And I think what we're starting to see is that we're starting to get some quite significant issues around the way that we're going to respond. And I think that's going to start to have big implications on the second aspect. So if you look at market development, there are new markets. If you look at product development in terms of the standards, qualifications that we're offering, new A levels, flexible learning patterns, e-learning, higher education in the workplace, traineeships, you've got a set of quite significant changes maybe being added to by uncertainty around some of those. But in effect, with new markets, market development, and new products, product development, it is a very different funding landscape. And I think that's something that then requires us to say, well, look, can we get away from our dependence on public funding? Can we increase full price and commercial income? And I think we've got to start doing this. I know some of you are very good. Those of you who have got HE provision, can we rationalize that HE provision to earn us bigger margins? Having a whole range of HE provisions, say at level 4 to 6 with classes of only 15, 16. They do make you money, but not as good as classes of 25 to 30, and therefore that's got to be something you've got to look at in terms of, have you got enough momentum there? And all of this requires significant changes to the way what we offer. You should rationalize it. Should we specialize? And some of the specialists have certainly achieved much better margins and much better quality because they've concentrated their efforts on different delivery models. And that starts to raise the issues about how innovative you need to be. And I think if we don't take the much more creative route and try and just simply do what we've always done, then because of the changing markets and the changing products, I think you're going to be in difficulty. I'll come back to, by the question about what do you call it, different pathways in the standards as a separate question. I've not ignored it, but I think coming to conclusion then, all providers, doesn't matter your college, independent training provider, local authority, academy chain, whatever, or an employer that's involved in delivery, I think this really is, for me, at the strategic level, you've got to get your senior leadership team, your governors, your board of directors, and then working with the middle managers and first line managers and the rest of your staff, say, right, what markets and products are we in? Which ones are staying the same? Which ones are growing? We might have to develop a more appropriate curriculum to meet that demand, for example, loan-funded provision, standards, and gradually move away from a dependence on public funding. And one of the organizations I work with, our aspiration is to move to at least 30% full cost activity by 2020, and not depend so much on public funding. But that means you've also got to get everything built in to all your operations. I mean, how well did you plan for the levy? How well did you see that as a major strategic change that needed an institutional response? We've got to get the quality right first time. And that means building improvement and innovation into all our operations. I think that's a medium to long-term change that, you know, you're already most likely undertaking. But if not, you've got to. And that means having the right investment strategies in terms of staff, in terms of skills and qualities, who you're going to take on, what kind of staff do we want to have in future, more flexible, more innovative, more creative, but also what kind of capital projects. Do we need big buildings? Do we need big colleges? Do we need something that's very much different as a conceptual model, which is using new technologies, the fact that a lot of learners are off the job now, so if they're off the job, does it necessarily need to be in a college? Can it be done online? Can it be done in other premises? Do we need to have big training centres when in fact it might be better to work with employers and use theirs, etc. Lots of innovation that's required, I think, but that really means a new way of doing things. I think the cultural changes for colleges and training providers are the most significant implications of this new funding. And our job working at e-Memoir and Learning Curve is not only to undertake that ourselves, but to work with others to help them do it. Because I think that context requires two levels of change. What I'd call the above the waterline, business processes, systems, technical skills, know-how. We know we need to have more commercial skills. We need to have faster systems. We need to have different curriculum. We need to have different delivery models. How do you deliver the 20% off the job training and not make it very difficult for the employer? But that really also requires the below the line, the much more significant, more difficult challenges of culture, of behaviors, and of leadership. And I think that's, for me, where the big changes. I think we've got to do the technology, the tools and techniques of delivery, and loan funded, and the digital account has done that, as well as new types of curriculum. But below the line, how does that, you know, how do we believe, what do we believe, what are behaviors, and how do we deliver those changes in an effective way? So hopefully that's given you a bit of some stimulus to take away and think, oh, that's a different way of looking at it, or yeah, we've actually started to address those questions. Many thanks for listening in. Many thanks for the questions. And I know one of the things that one of you has raised about the different pathways. Let me have a look at that, and I'll get back to, I don't know if it was Paul that was asking that question from NCFE. But I think that's is certainly been an issue for us with the different routes within one standard. There could be different pathways, which obviously might take you beyond what's the basic band. And obviously, can that be then something that you ask the employer to contribute to separately? We've already had that issue, by the way, Paul, with where a standard does not include a qualification, where the employer said, well, they want their apprentices to get a qualification, and they've paid us separately from what's coming in from the digital account for that qualification. And if that's been a separate contract between us and the employer, could be the same sort of arrangement. But I'll have to have a good look at it before I give you a full answer to that. So feel free to contact us. Don't forget to ask us about our subscription service. I know we've got some subscribers who have paid the gold membership to get these webinars. We offer you at least 40 webinars as part of your subscription. If not, have a good look at us. We're keen to help out, and we've got some interesting offers coming up over the summer period. So look out for us and look out for our website at e-Memoir.co.uk. Are there any more questions, Marek?
No, I can't see any further questions. Have I missed anything as well? If I've missed any questions, please let me know. What we'll do is we'll happily take them offline and come back to you right away. But thanks for those who provided an input there. I hope you've all found it useful and enjoyable also. I just want to thank Beej and also the contributions that you've all provided. If you're watching this on the video recording, I say, and you have any questions, please feel free to come back to us. But certainly share this and discuss with your colleagues, and we'll be more than happy to help. But what I'll do now, Beej, is I will stop the recording now, if that's okay with yourself.
That's okay. Thanks very much, then. Thanks very much for the questions. And please, as I said, use this recording and slides as maybe a discussion point with your colleagues in your institution, but also those of you maybe listening, and tell other people about what we're offering, and hopefully that's meeting your needs. Thanks very much for that feedback. That's good.